I made a conscious choice in that moment that we had to, for the sake of the children, I wasn't even thinking of myself at that moment, but for the sake of the children, we had to do whatever had to be done in a calm and stress-free way.
Hi, and welcome to Women Seeking Wholeness. This is Cherie Burton. I'm your host of this show for women who seek to feel, express, and be who they were created to be here and now, body and soul. Today, I've got Dr. Suzanne Henwood, and before we bring her on, I want to let you know about a couple things I have coming up. Number one, I am launching 2 online courses, the 22-day Depression Cleanse and the Emotional Wholeness Masterclass. I'm launching them in a very bundled amount of time, as well as a bundle for the 2 of them together this month only. And if you go to cherieburton.com/course, COURSE bundle, BUNDLE, coursebundle.com, then you will be able to find them with a kind of a waiting list type of thing in a pre-launch. So basically in this course bundle launch, you can get access to both of them for the price of one. So check that out, cherieburton.com/course bundle. Dr. Suzanne Henwood, she's a really fascinating lady. I met her last year in New Zealand when I was in Auckland, and I was able to spend some time on her back porch with our colleague, Gail Watanabe, as we discussed everything from neurochemistry to cellular alignment to generational issues. And my favorite thing to discuss with her, and where she shines and is niched in as an expert, is multiple braining. She is New Zealand's first master trainer in this field, and she brings with her into this discussion a wealth of knowledge about the body systems, this glorious body that we have. Okay, welcome, Suzanne. It's a joy to have you on the program. I know that you're literally across the world from me. It's morning for you in New Zealand, and I'm over here in Mountain Standard Time, USA. So it's your morning and my afternoon.
Yeah, we've got a beautiful sunny morning here in Auckland. So hello, Cherie.
Suzanne and I met. I'm going to kind of give you the roundabout of how we connect, because I never discount when someone shows up onto my path. I believe there's divine orchestrations and synchronicities that happen, and they're always leading us to a higher place and higher understanding. And in this case, I knew when I saw her in Auckland that she needed to be someone I interviewed. But I actually came across Suzanne through our mutual friend, Gail Watanabe. I lived in New Zealand for 6 months about 3 years ago. And just as I was kind of niching into, this field of holistic psychology and sort of helping people to heal from the inside out in more of a wholeness-based approach, I happened upon a book called mBraining, Using Your Multiple Brains to Do Cool Stuff. And it's written by a man named Grant Susalu and his associate Marvin Oka. I don't know how you say his last name, but I was so fascinated with this book because I had already kind of been teaching about 3 brains, mind, heart, and gut brain, in my work with helping people through emotional well-being and emotional healing and things like that. And so then I learned there's more brains than those. And I'm going, oh my gosh. So I literally devoured this book. I actually emailed Grant and I said, can I Skype with you? Can I talk to you? And so through another mutual friend in Auckland, I was able to connect to him and we talked. And anyway, I kind of lost touch with him. But then through Gail, I found that, what are you? You're like the first multiple braining trainer in New Zealand, master trainer in New Zealand. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm one of 2 master trainers and master coaches in the world.
Yes. And Grant is based in Australia, because I remember we had some mutual friends there. But
Grant's the main developer, and underneath Grant, there's myself and a guy called Wilbert Molenaar in the Netherlands who support Grant to get this out globally.
And it's so needed, because I love the emphasis on, and you had said this to me in a prior discussion, rewiring the human body. Not just your head brain, right? If you're going to transform, it's your body.
Absolutely. Absolutely right.
So you have a decade of experience as an associate professor in health and social sciences out there in New Zealand. And because you have this beautiful health and research background, you know that through statistical methods of research and the rigorous scientific standards that we now know that this whole thing about these multiple brains are actually scientifically based, like legitly.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're not talking metaphorical. We're talking real brains in our bodies.
So for the lay person who's never been introduced to this before, I mean, we know the body has intelligence. We've heard it in spiritual texts. We've heard it through kind of the woo-woo weird factor, whatever. I'm not trying to discount the other fields, but when it comes to science, walk us through kind of what mBraining is.
Sure. mBraining is a beautiful weave between that old ancient spiritual wisdom and the absolutely most modern cutting edge neuroscience. Neuroscience in a wider way, a lot of people use the term neuroscience and still just mean head, but neuro is a term that's far wider than head. So when we talk neuroscience, we're talking neurology right throughout the whole body. And I mean, I have huge respect for people who thousands of years ago knew this stuff without being able to show it. Now, as Western cynical people, we need the evidence, we need to see the pictures. And
That's me.
And it's taken us quite a while to get the imaging techniques good enough, detailed enough in order to actually show that what we always knew was there, now we can show is there. So just some of the fields where you might see that is things like meditation, mindfulness, tapping, the emotional freedom technique. There's lots of these techniques that are now getting beautiful scientific evidence to show not only that they work, but how they work and where they work in the body. So mBraining came from Grant Suzanne, who is the main developer, who believes very much in science and research and started reading material from all around the world and was seeing repeated information that the heart was a brain, that the gut was a brain. But at that point, this would have been 10 to 15 years ago, there was no one bringing it all together in one body of knowledge where we could work with one human as a system and say, if there's both a head brain, a heart brain, and a gut brain, how do we communicate with those in a systemic way? How can we communicate with all three? How can we get three all in alignment with each other? And so he did 4 or 5 years of work to find all the research that he could to back this up. He then created what was a coaching model and went out into the world for another 3 years doing behavioral modeling to check that the model worked in practice, and then launched mBraining as a field in 2012 in New Zealand. So we're very lucky here that we're at the forefront of it. So we're a very new field and ever growing and evolving. So since it came into fruition under the guise of the MBIT Coach Certification course, which is a 4-day course teaching all of the basics of using this, we now have multiple courses and extensions of that, taking on even newer science, because, information's coming out almost on a daily basis about the body.
This is kind of like a cross between information age and transformation age. So, this knowledge and wisdom kind of, there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom, but like the streaming of information. And I love that it's accessible. And with what you see, do you kind of feel like there's this hunger that people are having now to access the body wisdom?
Absolutely. I mean, people have been wanting some way of working with the body in a different way for thousands of years. I think what we offer now is a very simple how through mBraining. So up until now, we've known we've wanted to, we've tried and tested different things. Some things seem to have worked, but we haven't had evidence for them. Now we're actually showing people how to do this in a very real and yet quite simple way. I love the term profoundly simple and simply profound. And that really sums mBraining up, that when you learn the basics of the theory behind it, it really is profoundly simple. But the transformational changes we're allowing people to have for themselves through that guided process, and it is very much guided. We don't tell anybody what their own wisdom is. We guide them to find it within themselves, which just makes it such a beautiful privilege to work with this material.
So would you kind of say that mBraining is sort of accessing the body's centers of intelligence in their own sovereign domains?
Yeah, absolutely right. So what we do is we teach people about the centers of intelligence. We talk to them about how they communicate, because obviously the head brain has the beautiful language center. We're very good with words from the head, stories with the head. We make meaning and we create justification. The head's all very good at that job, and we want to keep those skills. But the heart and gut speak in different ways. And we've often heard of that still small voice, but nobody really teaches us what it sounds like or how to hear it. So, through a range of different techniques, we quieten the body down so that we can hear that voice, which might not be a true voice. It might be a picture or a feeling or sensation or a metaphor or a single word. So,
Mm.
it's teaching people to listen to themselves within and that intelligence center, and recognizing that it's always been there. They just haven't necessarily heard that voice or that message in the past.
Yeah, and many people from faith traditions would call that still small voice like the Holy Spirit or the Holy Ghost or the Spirit or
Yep.
spirit
Yep.
intelligence. I also have this, and tell me what you think about this, but I also kind of have this other theory, and it's not just my theory. I've heard other teachers talk about this, that there's the still small voice of your own soul. So there's like God, the voice of God in your mind and heart, and the rest of those intelligence centers that are like breathing you or giving you life. But then there's also like your own divine soul. How do you kind of see that?
Beautifully put. I don't know that I've got a form of words, but it would be very similar. I think each of your brains or intelligences has their own way of communicating that is about you. I think you do also have that soul part of you that begins before your physical body is born and will last long after your physical body is no longer living and functioning. And I also have a very strong faith structure. Mine happens to be Christian, but I've coached people from many, many faith structures. And I think there is also that voice of God, whoever your faith structure. So for me, it's God. I'll just use the word God because it's easy to put in a sentence. So for me, God also speaks to me through a still small voice. And it's about, how do you recognize which voices are yours and which ones are God's and which ones are your soul. And once you start to go down to that deeper level of connection, not only with yourself, it opens up that possibility of deeper connecting outside of you. And you begin to go down the kind of mindset that actually we are all one at one level. And so even when I speak to you, I'm speaking to me in a way at a different level. So it is exciting times, I think, where we're exploring this in ways that have been explored for thousands of years, but we're adding new nuance and detail to it.
Right. So, what's beautiful to me about this is we have kind of been programmed, and maybe that's not the right word, maybe socialized or what have you, that there's just one voice, one true voice in you. And I don't know. I know that you are a Christian, I am as well, but I ascribe to lots of other different ways of thinking and being in the world. But I kind of feel like we are kind of like conduits to other dimensions, that like maybe our loved ones come through and try to speak to us in our mind or our body, or there are a myriad of voices, and you could even say adversarial entities. So how does that fit into what you're talking about in terms of kind of like quieting the body down?
It's a great question. It's not something I have explored in huge depth. It's not a skill I have in listening to other people in that way, certainly people who might have passed. I think there'll always be an element of uncertainty, of not knowing. And in fact, I always get a little suspicious of people who claim they know
Right.
anything like that in real depth and have the answer. I have a doctorate of philosophy, so I guess I come from that whole stance of, is there even a truth, little alone what is the truth? And I think there's a truth to us in any moment. We believe what we believe as if it is a truth, but it's only our best guess with the information we have in that moment. So I prefer to go in with a curious mindset and a curiosity that says, I wonder what if or who if, and listening in to any message I get and then being curious and critical about it in order to determine what I believe, and it is only my belief, my map of the world, but what or who I believe that is that's speaking. I have no way of knowing in a absolutely rigorous way of knowing exactly who that is.
That's really powerfully stated. I'm in that camp as well. I feel like being in the mystery is why we're here on earth.
Mm.
And when someone comes forward and says, I know, well, I don't know that we can absolutely 100% completely know anything, except like you're saying, when you actually do tune in to the intelligence, that is reality for you though. Like you can't put it over and like, this is your network talking to you, right?
Yeah, and there we have got the evidence base to say that these networks exist, that through the science, there are now a set of criteria that have to exist in order that those complex neural adaptive networks are called brains. It's not mBraining calling them brains, it's the science literature. So we do know these intelligences exist, and gradually over time, we're getting more and more information about how they communicate and what they communicate. I think it's unlikely that anyone listening would not have heard some of the publicity around the gut brain, the microbiome, the way that mental health and gut health are being shown to be very tightly connected these days. So there's something that we have a little more information on. We can't still say absolutely specifically all about what the words are that are being used or what the message. By default, that message has to be interpreted within us. And as soon as we interpret information, we have biases and filters that we use. So again, it can only be your best truth or knowing in that moment. It can never be, in my view at least, it can never be an absolute truth.
Yeah. And what you're talking about of interpretation bias, we all have this filtering mechanism called perception. And I used to just think about perceptive filters with my mind brain. I've since kind of opened to this view of kind of what you're saying with these neural networks, where we have perceptions based on trauma or injury or even generational stuff, which I want to talk to you about after I go through this. But it feels like we are here to, and I say here, we've incarnated with this body we've inherited that is so rife with those perceptions kind of ingrained with the body we came into as a baby. And then now through situational forces and environmental forces that are at play. So that's where it, at least in my perception, becomes important to just check in and go, does this feel resonant? Does what that person in their perceptive space of being enlightened or whatever really resonate with my own being?
I think one of the authors that's coming to my mind as you're talking is Humberto Maturana, who says we're not human beings, we're human becomings.
I love it.
And because we know of neuroplasticity now, we do have the option that even though we know some of these traits are inherited, and I've seen papers that suggest they can track it back 14 generations in rodents in terms of emotional trauma. So it is in us. It might not have stemmed initially from within us, but it's become part of us through the generations. It might be stress when we were being formed in the womb. It might be socialization in those early years that has an enormous impact on how our nervous system develops. That first 2 to 3 years kind of sets our internal stress thermostat, if you like. But despite all of that, what we know and the hope that I hang on to and why I do what I do is that we have got this thing called neuroplasticity, and we have the ability to change those responses and the physical neural wiring inside of us so that we can choose this human becoming. Who is it we want to be in the world? who do we actually recognize in us that maybe we haven't liked? And not that I'm not the sort of person who would coach or offer therapeutic coaching around in any way denying who we've been or beating ourselves up for who we've been. We did the best we could at the time with the resources we had. But there is a sense of having that choice more than we ever thought possible, of going, yeah, that's who I was. It's created who I've become. And moving forward, this is who I want to be more of. And I love that. That's why I do the coaching that I do. It's to give people hope into the future, because life is so difficult for a lot of people right now and so stressful. And there's so much ill health being created because of the turmoil in our own bodies, that if we could give people that sense of hope back, that they could move forward in a deliberate and purposeful way into some greater meaning, to be of service to others, to find joy or love, whatever it is that they want to create. We now have tools to enable them to do that. And yes, I do know of some of the science around the hereditary issues behind traumas. If I think back 7 or 14 generations, which are 2 of the papers I've read, that takes us a long way back in history. And there's huge traumas have happened in the world in those generations. I mean, if I just think back to my grandparents, we're talking, the Great World War and beyond. Yeah, there was huge traumas in us, but I don't want that to define me, who I am going forward.
I agree. And I don't know if the same study you read is the one I've read, but about with mice, you talked about rodents, kind of the cherry blossom, if people want to Google that, the cherry blossom study. But basically, this fine tuning of genetic expression occurring through like epigenetics, and how, the DNA itself doesn't change, but the sequence can very wildly change depending on which parts. So like even though all the cells in our body share the same DNA, these markers can silence all of the irrelevant genes so that one can kind of rise to the top or whatever. And I'll probably post the study that just because it's so fascinating that like these mice that they studied, basically, I'm going to really get this paraphrased, but wasn't it that the rats' fathers or something were exposed to cocaine or something, or they were exposed to some kind of toxin, like a drug, and the fathers passed down to these mice pups? But maybe I'm just totally butchering this, but it feels like it was this now controversial field of epigenetics is now like blossoming because of these mice studies.
Yeah, and people like Bruce Lipton, Greg Braden, they're doing amazing work within the field of epigenetics. It's still not wholly accepted in the medical community. Bruce is a medic himself, of course, so he comes from that background. He understands what the objection is because you're taught about something for so long. It's a real cognitive dissonance to then put aside old beliefs and what you thought you knew to encompass new ones. If you even believe some of the epigenetic work, the fact that our thinking, our language physically changes the protein structure in the wall of our cells. The enormity of just that statement in relation to coaching and getting people to be really conscious of the negative thinking, and we all do it. We all have that negative voice that beats ourselves up from time to time. Helping people to become conscious of that and changing it, and knowing that that changes the physical structure of their bodies, that's incredibly powerful.
Absolutely. And the fear response is kind of where that cherry blossom study was headed. And the one I referenced before about the cocaine is that they now have verifiably seen that gets passed through, especially fathers with the sperm and those epigenetic markers. But with this particular study with the mice, they were just exposed to this odor that they associated with fear because they smelled the cherry blossom smell, and then they were zapped on the feet or something horrible. And then anytime that scent would blow into their cage, they would have the fear response. And then they found that this passed on even after this generation. I don't know how many generation of mice passed on before they started to notice that when they blew that cherry blossom smell into the cage, that there was a visceral fear response in their progeny. So I think that's super fascinating.
Yeah. And, what other fear responses have we learned genetically, but also socialization wise? Think of something really simple like a spider. If you have a mum who's, frightened of spiders, the risk is they can socialize the child into be frightened of spiders because the child sees how the mum responds.
Interesting. I totally have a fear of mice. So the fact I even brought that into the conversation, I've totally socialized my kids to fear mice. Well, let's go back a little bit to what you were talking about. I love what you were saying about human becoming and just that
Mm.
base of human potentiality. I think there's a whole emerging field just around that, with some social scientists and biologists and whatnot. So when you were talking about curiosity, I have heard before that curiosity trumps fear. So that people who get really, really curious and they kind of start like researching and reading up on things, that their fear response is dampened because they're just so passionate about what they're learning. And that you also said we have to kind of balance that with critical thinking. Do you feel like the logic brain is the most, obviously it's the most developed critical thinker, but are there ways that we can recognize maybe when the heart brain is speaking versus the gut brain versus the liver brain versus the kidney, you know what I mean? Like how do you know which to rely on? Maybe that's probably the best way I can phrase that. How do you know really when these intelligence centers are speaking to you or trying to communicate to your
Well, I think,
logic mind so you like pay attention?
yeah, I think I just heard two different questions. One is, how do you know which one to rely on?
Mhm.
And in mBraining, we say all of them because wisdom comes from true integration of all three. So often people in business in Western world are head dominated. We're educated to be head dominated. We rely on the head base. We rely on evidence base. The whole neoliberal workplace is around tick box and evidence. So mBraining would say we need to stop that being so dominant and actually listen to the heart and gut as well, and then allow the three to integrate. And that's where wisdom comes from. So
Mm.
in terms of which you rely on, well, we rely on all three. And in fact, at Master Coach, we teach another two. So we rely on all five. How do you know what you're hearing? I think is that learning to listen within and recognizing your own version of that communication. So part of that has to be a quietness. And I'm not just talking about sitting in a quiet room. I'm talking about your whole body coming into quietness.
Mm.
So we teach people how to balance their autonomic nervous systems so that they're neither in a very sympathetic nor highly parasympathetic dominant mode. They're in what we call coherence or balance. It's based on the work of HeartMath and Steve Elliott, who runs a website called coherence.com. So those two organizations have independently done some beautiful work about how we bring our systems into balance or quietness. It fits quite well with mindfulness, although it's different again from mindfulness. Mindfulness is about being non-judgmentally aware. There is a slight risk with that, that if someone's in a heavy stress response and they become aware of that stress response, that they could get hooked into the negative emotion of it. People who have done mindfulness will be familiar with going quiet, of focusing your attention on one thing. We choose to focus on the breath because it's through breathing that we have access through the diaphragm to the autonomic nervous system, and we can access the heart. The heart is what balances out this parasympathetic and sympathetic system within us.
Mhm.
So we will teach people to balance their systems through a simple breathing technique, and only then will we attempt to communicate with the heart, the gut, and the head in a deeper way. Once you are in that balance and you have that neurological quietness within you, it is a case of focusing attention where you want to hear the voice from. So if you focus attention at the heart space, and you might initially just get there by feeling the heartbeat, putting your hand on, flat of the palm of your hand over your heart area. By just feeling the heartbeat, you're bringing your attention and your focus to the heart space.
Mm.
And then respecting the heart as an intelligence and literally just asking it, What's truly important to you about this? And what we find is people just come up with that communication really, really easily once we've quietened the system down.
And it's really interesting when, I'm almost done with my 200 hours for yoga teacher training. And I just did it with my daughter because I was fascinated with the practice of yoga. It's basically the whole, like you were saying, kind of quieting the autonomic nervous system and getting out of fight or flight and allowing the body space and expansion so that you can come through, your true intelligence can come through. And what you were saying about breath, everything kind of rides on the breath, don't you feel like? I mean, it's everything.
And what we teach our MBIT coaches is not only what technique to use before coaching, we teach them the whole physiology and the theory behind that. So they really understand what they're changing by changing the breathing patterns. So it's not just a case of breathing this rhythm. A lot of people, they'll say, oh, I do box breathing. Can I do that? I do this. I do 5 and 8. Or it's about understanding what the breath in does to physiology, what the breath out does to physiology, what holding a breath does to physiology, so that you're constantly monitoring the person that you're working with and adapting those breathing patterns to bring them into this beautiful balance or coherence. It also means that if you have a client who is very stressed, you can teach them relaxation by teaching them a different breathing pattern in order to bring them down off of sympathetic, not necessarily into parasympathetic. That might bring them to balance. But if they want to sleep at night, you'll deliberately go further and teach them how to move on to that parasympathetic end. So I love the fact that, again, because it's all evidence-based and it's all actually orientated, we're teaching so much more than just a technique. We're teaching them how to work with the body in a wise way to get the results for that individual client in that moment.
Yeah. And I think it would be powerful. I've wanted to do an MBET workshop here in the States. It's just aligning my schedule, craziness, 5 kids, everything I've got going on. And we can definitely explore that, you and I, apart from this episode, and we'll definitely post that to the listeners if we get to that point. But, I love this discussion about kind of going within and asking those neural processing centers, those intelligence centers, and actually making contact. I think we segment healing so much in our society, go to the specialist for your gastroenterologist, and, go see the psychiatrist for this and go see the psychologist for that and go see the, all of these specialists, which serve a beautiful role. But I think you've hit on the key, and it's integration. It's communication. It's seeing yourself as a whole, not, we've got to address everything or nothing if we want to be truly well and be whole and feel whole. They're already whole. So would you agree? I mean, it's kind of like integration is the key to healing.
I absolutely agree. And that's why I love I work with a medical practice here in Auckland who refer me patients when they've gone for physical symptoms, but the GP perceives that there's a large stress or anxiety element within that, and he'll send them to me. And I work with them to reconnect within themselves to each of the intelligences and then align those intelligences. I had a lovely lady who just finished a series of sessions with me a couple of weeks ago. And I always do a review at the end. Let's look back. Where were you? How are you now? What's different now? What are you going to be, do behaviorally different? And she kind of said, I'm really worried. I'm not worried anymore. And it just completely transformed her whole way of being and thinking and feeling inside her body. And it was so unusual for her that it felt odd to be at peace. So it does literally change our experience of life, our phenomenology, when we work with people at this level.
Yeah. And you're also, you have 2 children.
I do.
And you went through a really traumatic experience where you kind of had to put these things into play, so to speak, at a very grassroots level.
I did. I teach in organizations about resilience and stress reduction. And I always say the moment at which you're jumping out of the plane in a crisis is not the point to be looking at where the parachute is or whether it's rolled correctly. You've got to have done all that work beforehand so that, when you jump out the plane, all you have to do is pull the cord. And I had been learning mBraining for a while. I can't remember exactly how long, 3 or 4 years. I was already teaching it. And unfortunately, coming back from a conference in Wellington, which is about an hour's flight away, I landed at the airport and got a phone call from my neighbor who said, "Where are you? Where are you?" And I said, "Coming home from the airport." "Why?" "There's flames coming out of your house."
Mm.
And there was nothing I could do in that I didn't even think logically. When you are overcome with that visceral stress response, it closes down your thinking center in your brain. And I didn't even think to ask, "Have you called the fire brigade?" or "What's happening?" I just put the phone down and tried to get hold of my family, which I couldn't get hold of them. They had come out of the house and left their phones in the house. So I had a 20-minute drive, not knowing what I was going to find when I got there, who I was going to find, what damage or injury had happened. And I don't want to kind of dwell on that. I imagine virtually all your listeners will have had something where some unexpected crisis has happened in their life and they can just relate to that moment of, "Oh, blimey, what do I do?"
Mm.
And I parked the car. I couldn't even get into my road. The fire brigade had blocked off the road. I had to park it on the main road and walk up. And as I walked up, my son ran towards me. He must have been 12 or 13 at the time. And he ran towards me in a onesie, barefooted, and just hugged me. And I made a conscious choice in that moment that we had to, for the sake of the children, I wasn't even thinking of myself at that moment, but for the sake of the children, we had to do whatever had to be done in a calm and stress-free way. That we had to be there for them, solid and grounded. And so it was like in that moment, jumping out the plane and pulling the ripcord, I just automatically went into all the processes that I had been doing in my body daily for the years beforehand, balanced down my system, got rid of that enormous stress response that's a natural response. It was still there, but it was contained in a way so that I could think carefully about what to do next. And short story, we lost everything in that house fire. We had to move out for a year while the house was rebuilt. We did that whole process with no stress. Now, even as I say that, I'm like going, really? Is that really true? And it is absolutely true. And in fact, I had a moment recently where, again, the enormity of how we'd handled that hit me. So if you're on Facebook, you will be familiar with Facebook memories popping back up on your feed.
And sometimes it's like a PTSD thing, right?
Yeah. So these photos popped up. I was in Australia training recently, and these photos popped up at the house fire. Your memories on Facebook. I'm like, yeah, I could do without remembering those. But what was really fascinating to me, and another moment of, boy, this stuff really works, is so using the mBraining breathing and communicating internally and using gratitude were my 3 ways of getting through that time without any stress. And I knew in the moment it had changed my response to the stress. I felt no stress. I was calm. It allowed us to make wise decisions about what needed to be done. I knew all of that. But these photos pop up a couple of weeks ago. And what was amazing was the memory that I went back to was all those good things. It was the gratitude. It was the stress-free. So it's not only impacted in the moment, it absolutely changed how I've stored all those memories.
Mm.
And that was another deeper layer of, knowing for me that, because I often recommend my clients use gratitude diaries, absolutely using the breathing. I even cheekily talk about prescribing breathing to them. But now I also talk to them about the longer term impact of doing that it changes how you store those memories, how you then review those memories down the line, which I hadn't realized at the time because I hadn't gone through that gap of time in my own process.
One of the things with the mBraining that I've loved learning is the emphasis on creativity, compassion, and courage. It's kind of like the 3 C's of integration, or, aligning the brains to achieve wisdom, as you referenced earlier. And how beautiful would the world be if we all had a go-to stress response that was actually a healing response, as opposed to of course, we're always going to be human, right? But the power of what you shared about your house fire is that you had files in your brain, plurals, brains. You had inputted, for lack of a better word, information into those brains that now you had the parachute. Now you had a go-to response that wasn't fear-based.
Yep.
It wasn't swimming in stress response. It was actually activating a healing mechanism that you were able to. What a gift to your kids. So how old? So your son was a teenager. How old was your daughter?
She's 4 years older than him, so she would have been 16, 17 at the time. Wow. One thing I would say to what you've just said is, and I guess it's just, I'm sure your readers will, or listeners will realize, stress and fear is not wrong.
Right.
Stress and fear are healthy emotions in the body. They're there for an absolute purpose. And I certainly would not want to ever coach somebody so that they can't have those natural responses. But what we've done in the human body is added in the ability to ramp up those fears and stress and keep throwing wood on the fire beyond them being useful responses.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that chronic stressing that can cause us issues, that allows us to keep replaying the story over and over and over in a negative way, that just keeps building the neurological pathway that allows us to keep the trauma. And I certainly don't want to belittle any traumas people have been through. People go through tough stuff, and they have the body is right to feel fear to keep themselves safe. The body is right to feel stress. It can be a motivator to take action. Recognizing it for what it is and then keeping it within safe boundaries. And often it's our head brain that will ramp that up into unhelpful response. Although as soon as you start working with the ANS as an intelligence in its own right and learning how that develops in early life, there are some children who, through no fault of their own, have not developed the very modern ventral vagal system, which is, if you read Stephen Porges' work on polyvagal, it's that humanness factor, that ability to look at someone and smile and check them out and see whether they really are something to be frightened of or whether it was a gut response from inside. Some kids don't develop that beautiful ventral vagal myelination of their vagus nerve. And so they're on constant high alert, constantly hypervigilant. And for those clients, it's about teaching them and tasking them to just gradually, safely bring down that set point of stress. And those people probably have never, ever felt peaceful, joyful, deeply happy. I had a guy on my Sydney coach certification who put up that he's a coach, he's a mature man, a very successful career person. And on his Facebook after the course the next day, he said, I just have to share, I think I felt for the first time joy and peace and happiness.
I'm really glad you differentiated that, because I too believe that in order for something to heal, it has to come up. We don't want to bypass it. We don't want to say, first of all, that sets people up for failure when you say only go to a healing response instead of a stress response, because we are actually wired for that. I think there's the U stress, which is the good stress, EU stress. And then there's distress, which is the firing of a chemical response that's actually quite inflammatory in the body.
Yeah.
But you can use that stress to fuel you so that you're now conquering the fear, or addressing the fear, as opposed to shutting down or just going into a knee-jerk kind of a reaction.
Yeah. And the damage that we can do to our bodies by holding in negative emotions and not dealing with them, not going and seeking assistance, whether it's through, a health coaching, whether it's through something like TRE, trauma release exercises, where we actually get that out of our body, I come from a British mentality where it's stiff upper lip, you don't show your emotion, you don't express anger. It's such an unhealthy way of dealing with that in the longer term. We have to find ways of expressing this safely, of getting it out the cells, which might be physical release by shaking or running or exercise or yoga, and then fully assessing where we're at inside ourselves. Are we in coherence? Are we aligned? Are we coming back to full, to use your words, that inner healing from the inside out?
And the body doesn't lie. When you were bringing that up about I think you said the ventral vagal, something or other with the vagus nerve, my youngest daughter, it's a whole story, but I didn't get custody. I was supposed to adopt her at birth, and it became a situation with birth mom and boyfriend, and she was taken into foster care when she was 3 weeks old, and I fought 6 court hearings to get her. Finally got her when she was 4 months old. And by the time I was her third mother by her 4th month of life, because she'd been in foster. And so when I got this little 4-month-old baby, she was literally a bundle of stress. She was sucking her thumb. She was singing herself to sleep. She was totally stiff. And she's, been through a lot. She was abused as a newborn. But I bring that up because even as a 4-year-old now, I can see her kind of in like a constant state of fight or flight, almost like she's got this protective mechanism in place where she does have that hypervigilance you mentioned. I can see it. So with a child who has not developed their logic brain, even if she had a very healthy start to life, children still don't have their logic brain developed. Isn't it like age 24, 25 before we actually know what the heck we're doing in life? And
they're saying now with guys, it can be as late as 32.
Oh, I believe it.
Fully developed, yeah.
That's so interesting. But yeah, with her, I mean, just as a really condensed, if you were my coach and you see that I have this daughter who's in the story, and she's darling, she's full of joy, she's all over the place, she's super sweet. As a mother, what can I do to lead her to some of these practices that she can relate to as a 4-year-old?
So much. And I'm sure you're already doing lots of them. But any of the ways of stimulating that vagus nerve, so humming together. In my coaching room, because I sometimes have children, I have windmills that you blow and bubbles that you blow.
Oh.
So using breath in a really creative, playful way, teaching her that through that breath, she can literally change how she's feeling inside. Rocking is another beautiful one. So, time on a swing, time on a rocking chair, or even just rocking together, laying together, doing your breathing and going through things you're grateful for from the day. There's a beautiful end of day practice parents can do with their children. So there's so many ways of stimulating that vagus nerve in a healthy way.
Where is that located? Is that brainstem area?
No, so it's your 10th cranial nerve. So it comes out of that brain stem, but it's called the wandering nerve, and it goes all the way around the body. So it's pretty much provides to all your abdominal organs and your heart and your lungs. It's a very diverse spread nerve. What is interesting is it has always been called the 10th cranial nerve, implication being that the brain uses it to pass information down to the body. But now we know at least 80% of the information is afferent or going up from the body to the brain. So this is your body's main way of communicating with the brain that you then interpret into what that means.
Fascinating. Yeah, you have more neural pathways that run, like from the heart to the brain or the gut to the brain than the other way around.
Yeah.
It's almost like your body is just trying to, it's like down up versus top down. Your body is just all the time trying to get through to that command center and the logic brain.
Absolutely, which is why it's very difficult to talk yourself out of stress because you're going against the flow of traffic.
Which that makes so much sense because affirmations, I will say, they do not always work.
Unless you create them in a way that you hold them at heart and gut level and you allow the affirmation to come up into your head.
Love it. And that could be done through visualization or
absolutely. Or song's another good way of getting into that, neurology. So there's loads of information written about this now, but if you look up any of the ways of stimulating vagus nerve and you do that for her over and over to the point that it just becomes her normal routine, she will then learn how to kind of reset that set point of her stressing as her body learns what it's like to feel at peace and safe. That's not something that's going to change overnight.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be something you want to build up on a daily basis for years so that she reestablishes what her safe place is. Creating a safe place for her, a little den in her room or even in her mind and imagination. For every one of those negative events, and it could just be, so let's take it away from your daughter, but let's take it into a workplace where someone's walking along a corridor and your boss looks at you funny. And you then say, oh, she hates me. She doesn't think I've done a good job. She's not going to give me the promotion, et cetera, et cetera. For every one of those little incidents of a negative or unresourceful emotional content, now the stats change slightly, but you're looking at needing around 7 or 8 positives just to get back to neutral.
Wow.
So every time anyone who has this hypervigilance feels unsafe because it triggers something from the past and that quick fire stress response takes over again, which is a completely natural response, they need to do at least 7 or 8 positive things just to get back to neutral again. And I don't think we always appreciate that enormity of that ratio. I know when I had my kids when they were young, I didn't know all this stuff. And if I ever shouted at them because I was cross, I would always try to go up and say, look, I'm really sorry I shouted at you. This is what I was struggling with, or this is what I need you to do. But I realize now that wasn't enough. That was only one. It didn't anywhere near combat the negative of the shout in the first place, whether it's parenting or work or families or communities. And I think, you said if we could only teach people this stuff, we could transform the whole world, basically. And we really could if we really understood what impact we had on people. Now, there will always be, no, maybe that's a limiting belief. At the moment, there are some people who will choose to use that in a negative way because they want to cause harm. And again, that's even more reason why for the rest of us, we need to have strategies to protect ourselves from that. But most people want to do good in the world. Most people want to do good for other people. And there are such simple ways of doing that if we just got this information out there.
I love it. Well, let's change the world. Let's get it out there. I'm doing my best on this end. I know you are.
Yeah.
And we could have a whole other discussion too on the sensory pathways, because that's where my research has taken me and how they activate all of these portals in the body and bring us to those states of a relaxation response and a healing response. But I just want to thank you for your time today. Let's do another episode at some point and really climb in. And let's also explore you coming out to the US and doing something with mBraining. I think it's really needed. I know there are people in the US that are teaching this, but I think your particular expertise and your academic background and scientific slant, I think really brings it in on a higher level that could open up more space for added collective research and teaching and collaboration. So I just thank you for your time. And I loved being in your backyard on your porch, overlooking Auckland and the harbor and the trees and having that conversation. When was that? Back in,
I've lost track of time, 6 months ago, maybe?
I think it was about 6 months ago. So I want to, revisit the discussion we had at that point too, about continuing to bring people into this place of, this is doable. It's simple. It doesn't have to be uber complicated. We don't have to, amass all this literature and theorizing. And it's just really like your body already knows.
It does. It does. And it's desperately trying to talk to you.
Well, thank you for talking to me. I was like, you were talking about Emma. I'm like, I don't know if I'll get to listen to the recording. So I'm like taking notes as you're talking to me. I got coached today. I needed it as a mom. So bless you. And thank you so much.
No, it's my absolute pleasure. Thank you for what you're doing and for the chance to share about my passion, which is mBraining.
And we will provide links for our listeners so that they can check out what you're doing and, maybe even wanting to do. Do you do coaching sessions through Zoom or Skype?
Yeah, I do. I absolutely do. And there's lots of fantastic MBIT coaches and trainers in the world. So yeah, I can put you in touch with someone local if you want face-to-face. There are a few freebies on my website. We've talked quite a bit about stress today, and it's an area I work a lot in. And there are some free downloads on my website around stress.
Your website, in case people can't see this in print form.
Yeah, mBraining4success.com, where the 4 is a number, not a word. So mBraining4success.com. And there's 2 or 3 free downloads specific to stress, guided meditations that take you through head, heart, and gut of just resetting your stress thermostat.
Perfect. I'm going to check that out myself. Thank you again, Suzanne, so much for your expertise and time today.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you again, Dr. Henwood, for bringing us back into the knowing of the brilliance of our bodies and what they're capable of. And I just also want to give a shout out to all of you to please share this podcast with your friends. Also, remember, I do have the course bundle launching this month, the Emotional Wholeness Masterclass and the 22-day Depression Cleanse, 2 for the price of 1. So get on my wait list at cherieburton.com/course bundle. See you next time.